Hi guys, Grandma here again. Anyway, we're going to start today on chapter 60 that has to do with the fall of Rome. Before I begin, because I'm going to do this in two parts, I wanted to first talk about why I'm doing this. Some people would like to know, and maybe even you guys want to know something. So, why I'm doing this? Because history. I believe history can be taken in perspective, which means it depends how you look at history. When I was in junior high, like you guys, I went through history from a secular viewpoint, and from the book, it rarely told anything about spiritual matters at all. In fact, all of history was pretty much on an economic basis. That means they said, well, they're doing well off if they had enough money. Or they would base everything on how materialistic the people were. It was all material. So when I look at that, I think it was all from a physical perspective, or it was all from a very humanistic. Humanistic means the way man would see it, and rather than the way that God would see it. Humanistic ways basically disregards God at all and basically looks at mankind as basically doing everything himself. Kind of like in the Bible when it talks about the Tower of Babel and how the men wanted to build their way to heaven and God destroyed. Well, anyway, and also that perspective I found going through school when I was your age that it was pretty boring. I thought, well, history is quite boring. I really don't understand. And I studied the wars and all and everything. We wrote everything down and memorized dates and all these things. But it really stuck with me. In fact, most people, if you ask them about history, they go, oh, I had to go through all that. I don't remember a thing. A lot of them don't remember a thing about Rome or anything. But you see, history from God's perspective changes because you see, it's man's deprivation is looked on by God's grace and mercy, and how God intervenes in man's ways. It's God's providence. Providence is God's goodness in the midst of dark times, in the midst of man's sin. So history really, to me, turns out to be his story, God's story. So the perspective pretty much changes, and then I look at my friend. God is my friend. God is my Savior. And I look through his eyes, and he shows me things, his handiwork, and different things that have happened through history, through his story. And that's why I decided to go through history again. And as I go through history again, to each time try to take God's story from whatever part of history it is. And definitely there is a spiritual perspective to all of history. So anyway, this week we're going to go on with the fall of Rome. And before I go on with that, we have studied some of these things already, but a little review. And then after the review, we'll do part 1 and then a part 2. So you don't have to listen to me so long. But anyway, the fall of Rome. Well, Rome's previous history. Well, you look at Rome and you wonder why Rome was considered any different from the other empires that had fallen in the world. And we saw great empires fall, like Egypt and Babylon, Persia. The Greeks, Alexander the Great had just met Alexandria in Africa, his greatest city, you know. And he died when he was only like 32 years old. And he had conquered the world. And then, of course, we have studied other parts of the world. We've studied about the Incas and the Aztecs. We've studied about India. We studied about China and Japan, and how certain whole groups and cities had fallen. We looked at Petra and looked at this hidden city that we really don't know that much about, yet we know it came to an end. So now we have Rome. So what was the difference? So when I think about Rome, there was one big exception with Rome. What? An exception with mankind? Well, something happened. Right in the midst of all this mess, a light shined through. Our Savior was born and lived and died on the cross, and came alive again for our sins, to save us from destruction in the midst of this Roman, the atrocities of Rome and all these things that happened. So this light begins to shine in the necropolis below Rome. In the catacombs, Christians are worshiping Jesus. They have a secret sign. It's Ichthus, the sign of the fish. And they're sharing the gospel. They're thrown into with lions in the Colosseum and eaten by lions. They're burned at stakes and all these things. Yet Christianity goes on and on. Executioners come to the Lord. Roman centurions come to the Lord. Jewish rabbis come to the Lord. And even barbarians come to the Lord. Well, I have a thing, because I much rather witness to a barbarian than to a civilized so-called person that thinks they have it all together. Barbarians were getting saved, as we learned last week with St. Patrick in Ireland. So now, to go back to Rome, God's grace and God's mercy shines. Something so sweet, so lovely, so wonderful is happening despite the circumstances of an empire that spiraled down to destruction. Okay, let me explain how bad things were. When we think of Rome, let's go back, and we went over some of this history. When we think of Rome, we think of the Etruscan kings, because the Etruscan kings came from probably the Italian city of Troy. And then legend says there were two brothers that were raised by wolves and then brought into being under the kingship of Rome. We have Romulus and Remus, that story. Well, the story is pretty tragic because Romulus kills Remus. And it's pretty ironic because the last emperor, when Rome falls, of the Western Roman civilization was named Romulus Augustus. And he was only 16 years old. Kind of crazy. So as we go through this, and I'm going to take a break here, and then we'll start again. And I'll go over some of those Roman emperors. It gets so exhausting, so I have to take a break, even before I begin. But I want you to look through the eyes of God, the eternal perspective of history. Okay, see you later, alligator.